Thank you, everyone, for coming out today. My name is Jean Paulo. I direct the Urban Democracy Lab, which is housed here at Gallatin School of New York University. We, along with Institute for Public Knowledge and the CGU, the Collaborative for Global Urbanism, are very happy, extremely happy today, actually, to have a distinguished guest among us, Gerardo Pisarello, who is the Deputy Mayor of Barcelona, and who's going to discuss some interesting things with us about sanctuary cities. We have a strong egalitarian ethos at the Urban Democracy Lab, so we don't make lengthy introductions. But let me just say that in addition to being deputy mayor, he is a very prominent public intellectual in Spain from the area of law. And he writes extensively. One of his books, Vivienda para Todos, Housing for All, is especially relevant among the other ones for our struggles today. And in dialogue with him will be another friend of ours, Juan Gonzalez, who maybe needs no introduction to this crowd, but is an award-winning journalist known for his participation in Democracy Now!, two-time winner of the George Polk Award for Commentary, and among other things, the founder and past president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. He is a wonderful historian, and as I was telling him earlier, he talks good. So we wanted to have someone besides a regular academic to be the interlocutor today. And my colleague and friend of the Urban Democracy Lab, Sophie Gonek, will say a couple of words to introduce us today.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I know people are kind of trickling in. I'm delighted to introduce Gerardo Pisarello. But before I begin, I want to just thank Jean Paulo for the introduction and for his enthusiasm in putting on this event. I want to thank Gordon, Douglas, and Sarah Dismore of IPK for their logistical support. Marianne Newman, who actually kind of brought us this event today. So if you don't know Marianne, you should. She's wonderful. And finally, at the Urban Democracy Lab, Becky Amato, who kind of makes many of our lives so much easier and is truly indispensable. So as I said, it's my great honor today to welcome the Deputy Mayor of Barcelona, Gerardo Pisarello, to our home here at NYU. Pisarello is a member of Barcelona en Comú, as all of you know, the citizens' coalition that came to power after an intense year of organizing. We saw a bunch of that in a documentary that was recently screened at the Star Bar, in which I saw many of you at. And Barcelona en Comú, which came to power in May 2015, came out in many ways of the kind of fierce and fiery social movements that have been a hallmark of Barcelona for the last decade or so. Here, special mention needs to be made to the Plataforma de Afectados por la Hipoteca, the PA, or Platform for People Affected by Mortgages, whose former spokesperson, Ada Colau, is now mayor of Barcelona, and thus, I think, the boss of some of the people in the room with us today. So it's exciting for me personally to welcome our team from Barcelona today because I spent a lot of time within that movement, albeit in Madrid with the PA there. So welcome today. And as I've written about, it was really in the assemblies and protests, in the kind of blocked evictions and the late night plenary sessions, where I saw new forms of solidarity and political horizons that emerged and took hold. In the process, these groups imagined an alternative urban future, one predicated on collaborative and collective life and commonality, sociability, and even, yes, sanctuary. The turn towards institutional engagement and formal electoral politics was in many ways an audacious one. Now, much of the politics that takes place kind of under the formal rubric of the state in Spain can often seem somewhat impenetrable, far removed from the struggles of everyday life. Okay, now I'm gonna go a little Californian on you, and I'm gonna let that out. And so in dealing with kind of the psychic moment, the psychic currents of despair in this current moment, those struggles of every day, I've been experimenting with mindfulness, which has been very helpful. And central to a lot of that practice is the breath. so everybody can kind of breathe in and breathe out, and maybe we'll feel a little bit better. So we remind ourselves with that breath that that breath is the mechanism that connects the outside world with our interiors, that we are porous beings kind of enmeshed in a greater ecology of life and activity. So what the hell does this have to do with municipalism in Barcelona, you're probably all thinking? Well, I think Barcelona en Comú and their counterparts in many cities throughout Spain demanded a similar symbiosis between interior and exterior, in which institutions are necessarily porous. They do and must rely on their constituents, and thus in this moment, there is a constant intermingling of the institutional interior with the messy and glorious audacity of everyday life. Hence, new experiments with citizen participation and regular mayoral visits to peripheral neighborhoods of the city. So while these new forms of urban politics might be related, in my metaphor, to the physiology of respiration, breathing in the city is actually foundational to our liberal understandings of the urban. As urbanists and historians know, the air of the medieval city would make man free. Here, the act of urban breathing would bestow upon the individual certain liberties and rights. There is here inherently an idea of sanctuary, but it falls far short. As in many of our contemporary cities, and indeed the foundation of our liberal political systems, it emphasizes the individual with little attention to collective life and cohabitation. It ignores the deep inequalities that unfold and deepen, often along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, and legal status. City air might make man, because it was definitely man, free, or in the case of sanctuary cities, accord certain rights and privileges. But it does not unshackle us from the burden of such inequality. San Francisco and New York, one is my hometown, the other is the city in which I currently reside, have been in many ways at the forefront of some of the sanctuary movement stuff that's gone on over the last decade, not just in this current moment. Both are highly unequal cities in which adequate housing is a central and contentious struggle. One of the things that heartens me about Barcelona en Comú's rise to power is the ways in which it has translated the struggle of the housing movement into praxis, in striving for a city that might be more just. Here, the anguish and joy of housing and the home, laden with the gendered and racialized dynamics of social reproduction, has connected with the street, with the neighborhood, and then with the city. So tonight, on the eve of an international women's strike, in which I hope many of you are taking part, I want to end with a question for Gerardo, for Juan, and for those of us here today. How might we think and act upon sanctuary, not as a passive category, but rather as an engaged process of dialogue, sociability, and radical urban democracy? Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon to everyone. It's really a pleasure to being here. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to share my breathtaking transition from academy and human rights activism toward the government of a city like Barcelona. So I thank the NYU and the Urban Democracy Lab for this invitation. And I think that Sophie has already said many of the things I wanted to say, and better than me, actually. But, I mean, I will start saying that some years ago, an encounter like the one we are having today would have been strange, probably. Of course, there has always been close ties between Barcelona and New York, but we are talking about something different today. Coming from different worlds, from different political cultures, we have found shared concerns such as the rise of inequality, the rise of racism and xenophobia, climate change that offers our cities the chance of joining for political action. And just a few months ago, we had 1,000 of people gathering in Barcelona to support the Women's March that was taking place in many other cities of the world. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had a huge demonstration in Barcelona in favor of refugees and against the restrictive policies laid by the central government in Spain and by the European Union. And how is that possible? I mean, before 2008, Spain was a young democracy with a strong bipartisanship and had been living for at least 4 decades, changing from one bubble to another. Housing bubbles, financial bubbles, European funding bubbles. And in 2010, I would say the situation started to deteriorate rapidly. We started to have high unemployment. Thousands of people were forced to face foreclosures and evictions because they couldn't pay their mortgages or they couldn't pay their rents. And you probably know it, but in the Spanish case, there's something special, is that, in fact, people just didn't lose their homes to foreclosure, but they kept their debts with the banks. And this situation condemned them to an authentic state of slavery, actually. And as a response to this situation, new social movements appears effectively. First of all, the Stop Foreclosures platform, and then the 15M movement, that was mainly formed by younger generations that felt excluded of the political system and of the labor market. I mean, we're talking about a generation that call themselves youth without future, and they call themselves the indignados, a generation that took the streets and took the squares shouting, we don't want to be a commodity into the hand of politicians and bankers, and asking for something as revolutionary as real democracy. And in the face of in fact, I would say that the rage of the Spanish population with this quintessential expression of the 15th of May could have turned into something nasty. But at least part of this rage was framed in terms that were compatible with democratic politics and social integration in Spain. Maybe if you're out of Spain, you may be more familiar with the case of Podemos. But to me, as Sophie was saying, and of course I'm not neutral maybe on that, some of the most important processes of change are taking place at the municipal level in Spain. Since the spring of 2015, the major country cities like Barcelona, Madrid, Coruña, Zaragoza are governed by citizens' platforms independent from traditional parties. And some of these platforms are led by social activists. And I think that's very special. In the case of Barcelona, where our current mayor, Ada Colau, is not only the first female mayor in the history of Barcelona, we have the first feminist government in Barcelona with a majority of women in the government, but she also was the spokeswoman of the platform against foreclosures, And I, myself, am the first deputy mayor born in Latin America, which is part also, I would say, of this democratic spring in European cities. And the same thing is happening in Catalonia, and it's happening in Spain. And so I think that we are probably talking about a unique political earthquake in the whole southern Europe. And this is not new. I mean, big cities had played a crucial role in the recovery of democracy in Spain in 1977 after Franco's death, and they played it also in 1931 when an overwhelming victory of the left in local elections opened the door to the Second Republic. I mean, it's very special to recall it here because, in fact, the United States led and staffed the Lincoln Brigade, and they had 1,000 of its 30,000 members died when fighting for the legitimate Republican government. And there is a memorial, I think, for the 13 students of the New York City College who died in that war. So it's important to keep those memories also. Now I say that in the profound crisis that brought the country to the brink of social collapse, cities emerged once more as an agent of transformation, and that's very important because they are not only, I would say, and Sophie was also saying that, the notes of social protest against the cuts in public budgets and social rights, but they were the sites of social self-organization and innovation to mitigate the impacts of the crisis, to redistribute its cost, and to devise some alternative politics also. Of course, in most of the cases, and we have to explain that, we won elections, but we didn't get the majority of the seats. And that's very important to say, because that means that we have had to reach agreement with other political forces in order to deploy our programs. For instance, in Barcelona, we have a city council which consists of 41 councillors, and we are just 11 out of 41. But despite of the difficulties, I would say that in just a couple of years, we have been able to do some important things. We have strongly increased, for instance, social investment, rental subsidies, school dinner grants for children, healthcare community programs. We have already fined major financial holdings, for instance, for having empty flats, which is symbolic, but it's a clear signal of the willingness of the new government to fight speculation in our cities. And actually, all these new political governments, these municipal governments, not only in Barcelona, are reforming crucial local policies and are willing and able to spend more and to spend better to tackle these pressing social problems, starting with housing. All these municipal governments have hung in front of their balconies signs that say, "Welcome refugees." All these governments have said very clearly, we want to be refugee cities, we want to be sanctuary cities, we want to be cities that take care of our people. We want to be cities that empower the most vulnerable, and we have multiplied our investment in legal and social assistance for asylum seekers, and in solidarity programs in those countries where this tragedy is more blatant. But sometimes we have to admit that it's very hard because we don't have legal competencies to do it, and because our central government neglects us the competencies and the possibilities of receiving more refugees, for instance. And I have to say that when I look at what cities around your country, the United States, are doing in terms of climate protection, minimum wages, and reception of migrants, defying the state and federal policies, I mean, I can only show respect. Paradoxically, I would say that the American urban renaissance has coincided with a certain setback of the political force of political municipalism in Europe. Having failed to obtain a powerful voice in the European institutions, city councils across Europe lost their ambition. And so recentralization loomed in the horizon in the whole Europe. And after, and a few years later, we could see how local governments were forced to carry a big share of the costs of the debt starting in 2008. Although as public administrations, they were the least responsible for overspending and for the generation of this debt. So this situation has forced us to challenge sometimes this austerity doctrine imposed by our central governments and the European Union in order to accomplish our electoral commitments with our citizens. And I would say that although the disaffection from politics and politicians remain very high, the citizens of Barcelona have now the highest degree of trust in the honesty of their municipal government's officials since local opinion polls started in 1980s. And I think that may have different explanations. When we come into office, the first thing we did was to sign a very too strict ethical code with salaries limitations, no allowances, We have also made significant changes in transparency, going, I would say, beyond a merely cosmetic or ritual accomplishment of the law towards a serious commitment with open government and with the fight against corruption. No? For instance, in Barcelona, one of the keystones of this strategy is protecting the whistleblower. I mean, we created an internet site in which it's possible to report illegal practices or misconduct in a way that guarantees anonymity. And what is more important, our cities haven't collapsed. That's what main media said when we got into office, but it didn't happen. So we proved that we could be newcomers, but that we are not stupid, actually. So we reduced our debt in the cities, and we showed that we could have economic policies both sound and redistributed. And after facing the social emergency, which is still there, and it's very, very serious, we are tackling some structural challenges also. And these are the important ones, because I think that we will be judged not only by the way we face the social emergency, but in the way that we face structural challenges in our cities. And so in our case, what that does mean, that we are investing for the first time in history in a strong public housing strategy based on rental and based on also cooperative housing that had never happened before in Barcelona. We are fostering social economy through its different forms. And after a decade of losing our industrial nerve, we are devising a reindustrialization strategy based also on, of course, taking the advantages of the digital revolution that we are living, but fostering the connection between small and medium enterprises, cooperatives, and micro initiatives within our neighborhoods. In Barcelona, like in New York, for instance, we are participating in the wave of Fab Labs, digital manufacturing, which should allow us to produce locally. We are pushing for a municipal wage. We are introducing reforms in public procurement so that we can guarantee social, labor, and environmental rights. We are also boosting a municipal energy operator in order to start the transition towards an energy model based on 100% renewable. I mean, we are doing a lot of things, actually, within our restricted legal competencies. Of course, we cannot fall into excessive pride because we still have very serious problems. Despite our effort, as I was telling you, inequality continues increasing in Barcelona, and we are already facing a new speculative bubble. Last year, rental prices have increased in about 15% in Barcelona. So Barcelona is getting more and more unaffordable, and we're very worried about that. Because we know that if we are in the institutions for something, is to promote fight against inequality, is to grant social and environmental justice, and as I was saying, is to empower all our citizens, but especially the most vulnerable ones. And so we know that history teaches us the success of many progressive policies lay not only, and I would say not so much in governmental structures, I mean, but in the strength of social movements, of our productive ecosystem, and in our ability to include the different voices that define our cities. I mean, they include women. I was telling that we are a feminist government, and we are proud of that. But there's a lot of work to do in this area. Inertias are very strong also. The bureaucratic machine has its inertias. And when you come into power, the easiest thing to do is to change the discourse, to change words. But when it comes to change the machine, even though it is a small or the smallest machine, which is the municipal ones, it's very hard to do it. So everything we had read from Max Weber, from the anarchist tradition, they were right. And fighting against big bureaucracies is very difficult. And at the same time, you need bureaucracy to make some of the basic changes. But as I was saying, I mean, our only opportunity is to rely on our people, on our social movements, on our communities, We know that, the only way to improve local governance is having strong social movements that support our transformation projects with a critical eye. It has been always like this in history. We come from social movements. We don't forget that. Our mayor has a sign in her door that say, never forget who we are and where we come from, and we try not to forget it. And we know that it's very important to have a respectful relationship with social movements, that social movements have to be autonomous from governments, and they have to organize themselves, they have to pressure from outside, and sometimes we can share common responsibilities, but we have different logics there. Sometimes it is argued that people don't care about politics, but we know that that's not true, that there are plenty of studies about political culture that show that people value democracy, but they distrust or find insufficient the kind of representative democracy that we have. And that's one of the main challenges we have, how to foster not only political democracy, but also economic democracy in our cities, and that means transforming the way we produce, we consume, and we organize our lives in our cities. Cities have always been a laboratory of democracy since the beginning of history, and they still are. And when we say that we want to be sanctuary cities, that we want to be refugee cities, that we want to be caring cities, that's what we are saying. That we don't want to be indifferent towards the sufferance of our neighbors, and we want to foster self-organization in order that everyone can develop an autonomous and a life with dignity. And I think that all these examples we are having in Spain prove that, and even in the United States also, prove that municipalism is probably the best device to democratize democracy. And not only to democratize democracy, but to prevent authoritarian regression, to prevent xenophobic regression, and to promote social and environmental changes in wider scales. I think that if we don't start from local governments, those changes will be very difficult to accomplish. Sometimes small changes are insufficient, but I think that they are contagious, and that's one of the virtues of municipalism. And I will finish with that proof that, and that's happening, as I said, also in the US, that despite all the obstacles, despite all the local governments have much more power than what they want us to believe. And the big challenge we have is how to administrate the day-to-day life without losing the utopian horizon that took us to power. That's it. Thank you very much. ¿Sí?
Good evening, everyone. And I was really excited when I got the invitation from Becky to do this conversation because she was not aware, but I'm in the process actually of finishing a book on a topic that's very related to our discussion tonight. I've been working now since I retired for the Daily News in last May, although I'm still working at Democracy Now! I've spent the last year pretty much putting together a book on the progressive local governments in the United States, taking a look at what's been happening, the experiments here with Bill de Blasio in the City Council here in New York, and Bill Peduto in Pittsburgh, and Betsy Hodges in Minneapolis, and Martin Walsh in Boston, and Eddie Murray in Seattle, and Ras Baraka in Newark, and Chaka Lumumba and his efforts in Jackson, and trying to see, because let's face it, folks, cities are all we got right now. Not only are they all we got, but they're where most of the people are. I think that's the key thing to understand. 70% of the world is urbanized, and it's going to continue to, the population is going to continue to gather in the cities. And as you were saying, there's immense resources and ability of movements to affect change. New York City's budget this year, I think it's $82 billion. New York City employs 350,000 people that work directly for the city. We're not talking about all the other agencies. We're just talking the ones that work directly for the city of New York, 350,000 people. So these cities, Paris, London, Barcelona, all of these cities are taking a new direction, and we've got to really analyze how it's developed. So I'm interested, first of all, to ask you, this whole issue of sanctuary cities, how do you, in Spain, how does that particularly break down? What are the policies of the central government that you are having to contend with at the local level? Because the cities in this country are on a collision course with the federal government. It's only going to be a matter of months before the cutoffs of funds begin and the battles in the courts and in the streets over the attempt of the central government to impose its will on the local cities. So I'm just wondering what you've encountered between the central government and your local government and how you've been able to deal with that.
Yes, I mean, in Spain, it is the central government, the one who has the competence to decide how many people, how many refugees they can receive. I mean, the European Union established a quota for different countries, and the Spanish government can decide how many of these refugees we can have. And we have asked to have in Barcelona thousands of refugees. We are prepared to do that. We have devoted important part of our budget in order to guarantee them with housing, and when we are facing a wall there. We are facing a wall. I mean, we are asking every week, we want to be a refugee city, we want to receive people here. And so we are using our, I mean, because cities have a strong voice, also may have a strong voice. We have a very strong mayor, she's very well known, and she's using all her capacity as an activist to protest against the central government policies and to put pressure on them. And that's what we are trying to do. And at the same time, we are using all our resources in order to have because we already have refugees in Barcelona. That's very interesting. We have many migrants in Barcelona which should have the status of refugees. I mean, they have entered as migrants, but they should have the status of refugees.
And the migrants are coming largely from what countries?
Well, I don't know. Right now, we had people from Ecuador, from Latin America, from Morocco. We have different communities in Barcelona, but many of them should have the status of asylum seekers. And actually, and that's not easy to do because it's not easy. I mean, when you are in you have the municipal government. Many of our migrants who don't have papers, for instance, they cannot work legally, and so they become street vendors. And when they become street vendors and occupy the center of the city, you have a small business protesting, and you as a government have to solve the situation and to deal with the situation. And it's not that easy, because on the one hand, you cannot allow the occupation or the intense occupation of public space, but you know that these people have no chances to survive. And what we have done is to use all our political determination and all our imagination to contract these people so that they can have legal papers, that they can work. And that's not easy to do because, I mean, laws don't help you. But I think that sometimes they try to make us believe that it's not possible. But if you have this legal imagination and political determination, you can do it. I mean, we say that we want to be rebel cities, as David Harvey says, but at the same time, we have to be competent cities. We have to think which are the best strategies the most soundest strategies to achieve these goals.
Let me ask you about another issue, which obviously was the basis of your getting in to power, is the whole issue of housing and of the housing movements. Clearly, the big issue in all of these cities, whether it's San Francisco or Seattle or New York or Chicago or Spain, for Paris or London or Barcelona, Madrid, is the commodification of public space. And the reality that there is a growing divide, even as the cities are growing, it's largely what they call the creative class that's moving in and pushing out those who are more working class and poor. What kind of policies have you been able to institute since, because you've been in almost 2 years now, right?
2 years now,
So,
now in May.
what kind of policies have you been able to institute to secure the residences of the working class and lower income populations of Barcelona?
Well, as I said, the first thing we did was to change budgetary priorities. And because I think we had two challenges. The first one was trying to control the bureaucratic machine, just to make it work in a different direction, and then to control the budget. And although we are a minority government, we could reach agreement with other leftist political forces in our municipality. And so we have been able to change priorities in investment, for instance, in social investment. So we have multiplied rental subsidies, as I said, school grants, just to tackle the social emergency. That was very, very serious. And then what we did, I mean, first of all, we started negotiating with banks because many of the housing stock was in hand of banks. And we sent them a clear message. You cannot speculate with the basic good like housing. I mean, housing in a city like Barcelona cannot be a commodity, cannot be a privilege just for a few. This is a human right, and we are eager as a municipality to have this housing to put in rental. And so at the beginning, some of the banks didn't accept this deal, and so we fined some of these financial institutions. As I said, it was symbolic, but it's more than $500,000. And then we have been able to...
In other words, you impose fines on them if they kept their properties vacant.
If they kept their properties vacant, exactly. And then they accepted to negotiate, and we recovered like 500 flats from the banks. And at the same time, we are trying to develop, a very strong housing policy, social housing policy, with a lot of municipal investment, I would say. In Barcelona, we just have 1% of our housing stock is social housing, when in Paris or Amsterdam, that reaches 20%. And so there's a lot of work to do. And in the meantime, we have also deployed a special unit against residential exclusion. And that means that when a family is threatened by eviction, we immediately intervene in order to assure that this family doesn't finish in the street. And that may mean two things. Or we pay part of the rent, or we guarantee them social housing. That's what we can do now. And what is very interesting, I would say, is that when we have a situation of an eviction, which is ordered by the judiciary, our councillors from Twitter, they call people to go there and to stop the eviction.
That's very similar to some of the stuff that's been done here in New York City. I know Mayor de Blasio and the council have sharply increased legal support for tenants who are under threat of eviction, so that the numbers of evictions have dropped dramatically over the last 2 years. Now, the price of housing continues to go up, but the number of people being directly evicted because they couldn't pay rent has
Same
dropped
thing in
dramatically.
Barcelona. Evictions have decreased this last year. We have 2,000 less evictions in Barcelona, although prices are increasing dramatically.
Now, what about the private equity issue? I remember about a year or two ago, Blackstone was the #1 property owner in Spain, as they are private equity firm here in the United States. The #1 property owner of individual homes in the United States after the Great Recession is Blackstone. And what's happened with private equity trying to speculate on the urban housing there?
That's a very serious problem. That's a very serious problem because we have all these hedge funds buying entire buildings in Barcelona, in some of our neighborhoods. I mean, there's a speculative problem there, which is very serious. And what we are trying to do, I mean, which is not a definite solution. I mean, we try to buy some of these buildings before they can buy them, and that's, I mean, that costs a lot of money. But until now, we haven't found useful tools in order to fight this situation. But actually, I mean, I would say that when it comes, when we have to deal with the private sector, that's what we are saying. I mean, we have to identify who are the authentic sharks here. And these speculative investors, these are the sharks. And we have said, these are enemies of the Barcelona City Council. We don't want them here. I mean, if we talk about productive investments in Barcelona, people who want to go there, and from New York or from other cities, and to some small and medium enterprises, I don't know, in technologies, in manufacturing, they are welcome to the city. That's fine. But speculation, those are not welcome in our city.
I wanted to ask you about you mentioned that it's difficult to, at the same time, deal with the problems of administration while maintaining the original goals of the movement. Mm-hmm. Well, in the United States, we've had waves of populist governments in the past, and there were over 100 socialist mayors in the United States in the early 1900s. But inevitably what happens is capitalism has an ability to, one, corrupt sectors of that progressive movement, and we see that public corruption is a worldwide problem. It doesn't matter whether you call yourself a socialist government, a centrist government, or whatever. When enough money is dangled in front of enough politicians, a certain percentage of them will bite. So how do you guard against the sugar-coated bullets of corruption within your ranks? And then how do you deal with the political differences that inevitably occur in any social movement as to how do you maintain the unity of the movement once you're now involved in the nuts and bolts of actually governing and not just complaining about government?
Right. Well, first of all, I have to say that Barcelona has a tradition of very strong social movements, and there's also an anarchist tradition. And the anarchist tradition, I think, has taught us something which is very important. It is that there is no such a thing as a good power. I mean, power is always potentially dangerous, so it needs to be limited. It needs to be controlled. Even our comrades' power has to be controlled. Even our institutional power has to be controlled. And so I think that's why the first thing we did was to sign this ethical code, imposing ourselves salaries limitation of mandates, and no allowances. That regarding to us. I mean, now, and I don't think that's a great thing to say, but the mayor of Barcelona is earning less than most of the people that works with her in her office. And so that was one of the first things.
We voluntarily
did it. We voluntarily did it. And then we may have a discussion if that's fair in terms when you have families, responsibilities, kids, etc. But I think that was, a way of protecting our project. And then, I mean, we have done an important job in transparency. I mean, we have, digital transparency. All our budget is online. We have restricted municipal direct contracts, because one of the causes of corruption is public procurement. When the municipality contracts a service with certain companies, then the corruption comes. No? And so we have limited that dramatically. As I was saying just a minute ago, we have implemented some programs like this one, protecting the whistleblower, and so we can receive these complaints, these anonymous complaints when a worker detects a case of corruption. And so these are some of the things that we are doing. And as you said, I mean, we are perfectly aware that the key, that the crucial issue is how to maintain the street organized and strong. And that's not that easy, because many of social activists from Barcelona are now in office. They were in the street and they are now in office. Sometimes when I talk to Ada Colau, to our mayor, she says, well, if I could be in the streets now, I would organize a movement in favor of refugees, but I cannot do it as a mayor. I mean, as a mayor, I have many limitations to organize a movement. I was freer when I was a social activist in a certain way. So what we are doing, as I said, is trying to respect the autonomy of the movement. But it's true that in a certain way, the streets are weaker now than a couple of years ago, because some of the people say, well, you have, these social activists in power, maybe they will solve things, so we can just, go home and wait for the changes. And that's one of the dangers we have, because sometimes it's the capacity, as you say, of capitalism to corrupt and to co-opt, but sometimes it's something a little bit more complex, I would say.
I want to ask you about tax policy and what kind of freedom you have within the tax policy. Because I've been studying a lot of the cities around the United States. That's played a key role in what they're able to do. In Seattle, they created a land trust, and any commercial building that's sold in the city, there's a tax on it that goes into a land trust. In New York City and in the state, as a result of the millionaire's tax that was passed several years ago, which the current governor really did not want, but ended up benefiting from. The dirty secret in New York State is that the state and the city are swimming in money. They have enormous amounts of surpluses every year as a result of a more progressive tax policy that was adopted several years back. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, what kind of freedom do you have on tax policy to help fund some of the projects that you're talking about, trying to be able to, what are the taxes that you directly control as opposed to the central government?
Right. Well, as I was explaining, in these years, there has been a process of recentralization, a dramatical process of recentralization. So municipalities have lost part of their resources and their basic competencies. For instance, in the case of Barcelona, half of our budget comes, or more than half of our budget comes from central governments. They transfer the money to the city. So they have a tool to suffocate municipal governments, and that they are doing so in many Spanish cities. But at the same time, we have power we can collect property taxes, for instance. And so, I mean, the previous conservative government raised these property taxes to the most vulnerable families. And so what we did was to freeze these increases for the most vulnerable, and we push it for the 5%, for the most affluent 5% of the property owners of the city. So I think that's something important we've been able to do, to have a progressive, socially and environmentally progressive tax policy. We have been able to have that.
But I presume you can argue, isn't Barcelona the industrial center of Spain? So that you're producing more wealth at the same time, aren't you?
Well, Barcelona, unfortunately, Barcelona is not an industrial center no more. I mean, basically, it has services.
Services.
Tech, services, right. But, I mean, we just have this basic tool. I mean, that's property tax. Oh, I forgot what I was going to explain you. No, basically.
Oh, okay. Well, in terms of this issue of when you mentioned that you have 11 members on the city council, right? So you don't have a majority. I mean, some of these progressive mayors here in the United States do have a majority. Peduro has a majority in Pittsburgh.
Right.
De Blasio effectively has. You could argue that the New York City government, in not just the mayor, but in the council and the other citywide positions, is probably the most radical in the history of the city. So how do you then function in a minority government situation when you're trying to get legislation passed?
Well, from the physical standpoint, it was unbearable. I mean, it was a tragedy at the beginning because we didn't know the institution, so we got there. That was fantastic. I mean, new people come into office, but we didn't know how the administration worked. So we had to learn how it worked, and we were just 11 councillors for a city of 1.5 million people, and that wasn't that easy. So we had to concentrate many areas in one councillor because our councillors are directly elected by the people. They are not appointed by the mayor.
Right.
And so we are all elected by our constituencies, and it was really difficult at the beginning. And now, after a year, we decide to incorporate the Socialist Party into government. That's been a very controversial issue because the Socialist Party and the Popular Party were the main parties in Spanish history. They were the traditional parties. And we had in Europe some experience with the socialist parties, which are social democrats parties, governing with let's say, communist or green parties in other cities, but they being the majority. And so in Barcelona, we have a different situation where our political platform has the majority and socialists are the minority there. So that means that we can control in a certain way the basic areas of the government, but we needed to expand it because it would have been impossible to survive otherwise.
And finally, I wanted to ask you in terms of when you look across Europe at the rising anti-immigrant and right-wing populist movements in other countries, what your sense is of why Spain so far has been going in a different direction, at least at the urban level, compared to what's going on in some of the other countries in Europe?
Well, I would say that the emergence of these new political options like Podemos or like these municipal platforms has been decisive because, as I said, all the anger that people had, instead of going to racist parties or to xenophobic party, at least partly, they went to these platforms. And I think that's some of the challenges we have. We cannot repeat the story of social democrats parties. We cannot repeat the story of let's say, a weak reformism in our cities, because we will fail, because inequalities are increasing dramatically, and we have many people living under desperate situations. So, and that's one of the challenges we have. We are minority governments. We don't have all the tools we need, but if we don't succeed in offering a response to the working class, to the unemployed, to people who are being expelled of the system, then we will have the extreme right and all these racist options, taking power, and that'd be a tragedy.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for that. I'm going to open it up to questions that any of you in the audience may have to Geraldo. Right here.
Thank you very much for the organizers of the event, and Gerardo, thank you for coming. I have a question regarding one of the things that is really attractive to me about municipalism, and and it's good that to emphasize that this is a movement that spread across 7 other cities in Spain, and it's Barcelona is obviously iconic and has taken a lot of the limelight, but that this is a movement, municipalism, this idea that I think Juan is trying to bring here to the U.S. as well, right, to land here. One of the attractive things about it is that this ethics code was collectively drafted, right? That the idea of extending and broadening participation, right? Citizen, and not just participation to citizens, but to non-citizens as well, right? Through neighborhood assemblies, through online platforms, right? So I'm wondering, one of the questions I have is that this process of like a collectively drafted platform, policy platform, and a collectively drafted code of ethics, right? Of giving people new means of participating in the political process and feeling like they're accomplices, not just voters, right? I think is really key. And how do you keep that up once you're in power, right? How do you continue to decentralize decision making, to give communities voice in all sorts of decisions that affect the municipal government?
Well, yes. I mean, one of the risks when you get into office is to get trapped there, trapped in the cage, no? And so we have made an extraordinary effort to go out, to go out to the neighborhoods. And so, for instance, our mayor, she goes twice a month to different districts of the city, and she holds there open assemblies with the neighborhoods, with everyone, just not partisan. So people come there to criticize some of the policies, to ask questions, but people feel relief when they find that the mayor is there listening to them. And so that's something that we've done. We've done it in a very discreet way. I mean, we don't publish it in the media, but just in the concrete neighborhoods. And that works really fine. And at the same time, I mean, we have made an extraordinary effort to develop specific programs in order to motivate participation. I mean, participatory budgets. We have made an extraordinary effort to do that. It's not been that easy. I mean, I have to admit. I mean, and we have trying to use some digital tools. For instance, we have a program in Barcelona called Decidim, which is Barcelona Decides, and that has involved about 27,000 people making proposals to the government. And for instance, our municipal plan for the next 4 years, from people from the districts, from the different districts of the city, they've been able to make proposals. They have made 10,000 different proposals, and we have incorporated 72% of these proposals. For instance, people complain because funeral service in Barcelona were very expensive. And after that, we decided as a government to create a municipal operator in order to compete with traditional oligopolies in the sector and to reduce prices of the funeral services. Or people ask to municipal the water, and that's one of the main objectives of the water, to recuperate the water as a basic good, as a common good. Water is privatized now in Barcelona, and that's been the cause of corruption in many cases between private companies and traditional parties, and we're trying to remunicipalize this service for Barcelona, and that's thanks also to social participation. But I would say that we have two challenges here. On the one side, we cannot expect our neighbors to be heroes. I mean, to be in assemblies for 5 hours or 6 hours, because some of them, especially when they are working class, they have children, they have their jobs, they come home tired, and so we have to improve and the way and the tools to make them participate, and that's one of the challenges we have. And that's why it is so important to combine face-to-face participation with digital and virtual participation. But at the same time, we have another challenge, is that every time that we give a rental subsidy, that we give a subsidy for vulnerable families, I mean, we have to guarantee these people not to be excluded, but at the same time, it would be a tragedy if these people just go home, you know, and they become like private citizens with their social allowances and do not participate. In other words, one of the challenges we have is how to improve the situation of our people, and at the same time without converting them in private citizens that don't want to participate in public affairs.
One of the things you raised there about municipal works is, I think one of the great achievements of the early progressive movement of the early 1900s was that so many cities began having their own municipally owned gas companies, electric companies, and there's still in cities across the country those remnants of those reforms. But that was one of the actual changes that occurred from that early tidal wave that came of progressive politics in America. So,
well, I would say that the main difference is that in the 60s, that the role of the state in the economy was much more strong, and it was much more widely accepted. But our situation is we come from 40 years of neoliberal policies that have concentrated power in private hands, and that's one of the difficulties we have, because we are like progressive governments, but not in the 60s or not in the 70s, but in 2017, after one of the most serious capitalist crises that we've had. And so how to challenge this kind of financialized capitalism, that's very difficult to do. And that's why you have to distinguish. I mean, in Barcelona, we are fostering social and cooperative economy, which is 7% of our gross product in the city. But we have the other 93%, which is conventional capitalist economy. And what should we do there? And we have many companies that work in this, traditional market basis. And what we can do there is just, to negotiate with them, to impose social clauses, to impose environmental, they will not disappear. So we have to take advantage of the best of this productive ecosystem, to pick the best of them and to work with them.
anyone else over here?
I'm wondering if you could talk about the relationship between what's happening at the city level in Barcelona and things like Podemos and this kind of national scale efforts to take back, state power at a bigger level. Because one thing that seems to be a challenge facing these kind of progressive movements in the U.S. is that you have people like, say, Kshama Sawant, people like de Blasio, folks in different parts of the country who are doing, similar-looking work, but without sort of a brand that's coherent. And so, if you could talk about the ways that that's been useful, the ways that that's been, challenging, potentially as Podemos, it seems to have been going through some turmoil lately. So yeah, just the way that kind of, feeds or can maybe even detract from the work you're doing locally.
Yes, as you may know, we didn't come to power as a traditional political party. We were a citizen platform integrated by social activists, people from social movements, people from some traditional leftist parties, and then Podemos is also there. We have people coming from Podemos in our government. But I would say that our hypotheses were different. Podemos decided to take advantage of the opportunity of European elections, and they decided to break in. And they succeeded. They were very audacious because they succeeded. With no links with financial powers, with big media, They obtained 5 seats in the European Parliament, and so they were able to start a very interesting process, but originated in the center of Spain. Our hypothesis was completely different because it was a municipalist hypothesis. We said we cannot start at the national level, at the state level. We have to start at the local level because the local level is what we know best. I mean, we are from Barcelona. We were social movements for Barcelona. We know our people. We know our neighbors. And that's what we have to start it because radicalizing democracy is more likely in the local level than in other scales. And that's what we did. And I think that these municipal platforms have been more successful in this sense. I mean, I cannot criticize Podemos because without Podemos, our municipal governments would be even weaker because we still have the right governing in Spain, but we have a weakened right governing there. Imagine that in the United States, you have the Republicans, the Democrats, and you have a very strong independent party like Podemos, no, which has 71 seats in the state Congress out of 350. That's very important, and it had never happened since Franco's death. So I think these are different ways. I think the municipal ways is virtuous in many senses, but I also have to admit that we are facing some challenges because when we were at the municipal government, we felt that we have to protect ourselves from other scales. And what was the best way to protect ourselves from the state government or the federal government? Well, running for elections in the other scales. So we had to build up political platforms for these other scales. And that's a problem because you don't have enough people to do it. We have many of our social activists were in Barcelona, and we had to build a political platform for Catalonia, and then we had to build a political platform also for Spain from Catalonia, and that's not that easy. And when you do that, you see all these problems being reproduced. Because when you create structures, I think that if you don't have structures, you have a problem. But if you have structures, you also have problems. And at the local level is where you can minimize those risks. And that's why municipalism is so strong. But sometimes, and I think that's, well, one thing that we'll have to see how it ends, municipalism needs times to grow. And these times have to be slow times. But sometimes history is not slow. History accelerates, and so they don't allow you to grow slowly.
Okay, well, I think we're going to, I've been given the signal that we have to end it here, but I think we are going to have a reception afterwards, so there'll be plenty of time to talk individually with Gerardo about the amazing experiment and going on in Barcelona. And again, I want to urge all of us here in the United States, there are experiments going on here that we've got to pay more attention to and get involved with because I'm especially focused on resolving the differences among the progressives because obviously in the times we live in right now, those differences pale in comparison to what we're confronting. So thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to you for your amazing presentation.